Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Henry had always believed he'd built something solid. At 20, when Natalie showed up pregnant, he didn't hesitate. He married her, took responsibility, and worked hard to give his family a decent life. 22 years later, looking at Benjamin, his son, he felt every sacrifice had been worth it. The young man was smart, studious, and had good friends. One of them was James, a 23-year-old he'd met in college who quickly became a constant presence in their home. Henry liked James. The guy was polite, respectful, and always offered to help with small tasks. They'd talk about sports, politics, life. It was almost like having another son around. But something started to bother Henry. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, just a nagging feeling that something was off. He first noticed it in James's behavior. Whenever Natalie walked into the room, the young man would completely change. His body would tense up, his words would die in his throat, and his eyes would fix on anything but her. James would make excuses to leave, needed to grab something from the car, had an urgent call to make, had to use the bathroom. The pattern was too clear to be coincidence. Henry casually mentioned it to Benjamin one Saturday afternoon while they were washing the car together. His son just shrugged and said James was a bit shy around adults, that it was normal. But it didn't feel normal. It was a palpable, almost physical discomfort that Henry could feel cutting through the room whenever his wife and his son's friend were in the same space. What turned curiosity into real suspicion was Natalie herself. Henry began noticing subtle changes in her behavior. She'd always taken care with her appearance, but now there was a different intensity on days she knew James would be coming over. Her clothes became tighter, her necklines lower, her makeup more elaborate. Natalie started wearing perfumes Henry didn't even know she owned, sweet, heavy scents that filled the house. And then there was the way she positioned herself around James. She'd sit closer than necessary on the couch, lean over him to grab the remote, touch his arm when making a casual comment. Her laughter grew louder, more frequent, even when James said something that wasn't funny at all. Henry watched all of this with a growing tightness in his chest, wanting to believe he was imagining things, that his mind was inventing problems where none existed. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. Henry had gone out to take care of some errands at the bank, but the manager was in a meeting, so he decided to head home earlier than planned. Pulling into the garage, he noticed James's car parked on the street. That was odd. Benjamin had mentioned at breakfast that he had classes all day. Henry walked in through the front door to find the house silent. No sign of Natalie or James in the living room or kitchen. As he started up the stairs, he heard the back door close. He rushed to the bedroom window and saw James hurrying across the backyard, face flushed, moving like someone trying to escape. Henry raced downstairs and found Natalie in the kitchen, fussing with her hair in the window's reflection, her lips slightly swollen. She smiled when she saw him, saying she was just putting away groceries and that James had dropped by to pick up some books Benjamin had forgotten. The explanation made sense, but something in her tone, in the way she avoided looking Henry in the eye, set off every alarm in his head. That night, Henry barely slept. He tossed and turned, staring at Natalie asleep beside him, wondering who this woman really was. Was he losing his mind? Were 20 years of marriage making him see betrayal where there was only harmless friendship? But James's discomfort, Natalie's changes, the scene that afternoon, it all formed a pattern his gut refused to ignore. The next day, during his lunch break, Henry walked into an electronics store. He talked to the clerk about home security systems. 20 minutes later, he walked out with 3 small, discreet surveillance cameras. He hated the idea of spying on his own home, of doubting his wife like this. But he needed to know. He needed to either confirm or rule out the suspicion that was eating away at his peace. He installed the cameras strategically. One in the living room, hidden among the books on the shelf. Another in the kitchen, behind the wall clock. The third in the hallway leading to the bedrooms, tucked into the smoke detector. all connected to an app on his phone that recorded and stored footage in the cloud. Henry set them to record only when motion was detected. For the first 3 days, nothing significant appeared, just Natalie doing everyday chores, himself coming home from work, Benjamin moving through the house. Henry started feeling foolish, paranoid, wondering if he was destroying his marriage's trust over an unfounded hunch. But everything changed on Thursday. Henry was at the office when he got a motion alert. It was 3 in the afternoon. Benjamin had classes until 6. He opened the app, selected the living room camera, and hit play. The screen showed Natalie walking into frame, fluffing couch cushions, fixing her hair. She checked her phone, smiled, then went to the window and looked outside. Minutes later, James appeared on screen. He walked in through the front door like it was completely normal, as if he had a key. Natalie turned, and the smile that spread across her face made Henry's stomach twist. It wasn't the smile she gave Henry. It was something else, predatory, seductive, loaded with intention. Henry watched, unable to look away, as Natalie moved closer to James. The young man stood frozen, clearly uneasy, but didn't pull away when she touched his arm. Natalie said something Henry couldn't hear. The cameras had no audio, but her body language said it all. She leaned in close, her hand sliding from his arm to his chest. James seemed caught between resisting and giving in, fists clenched, jaw tight. Natalie kept going, ran her fingers through his hair, brought her face near his. James closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and then it happened. His hands gripped Natalie's waist and pulled her to him, kissing her deeply. Henry dropped his phone on the desk as if it had burned his hands. The next few hours were a blur. Henry couldn't process what he'd just seen. His wife, the woman he'd shared over 20 years of his life with, the mother of his child, kissing his son's best friend, a 23-year-old. The betrayal alone would have been devastating, but there were layers of violation that made it grotesquely worse. Natalie wasn't just being unfaithful. She was preying on someone Benjamin's age, manipulating the trust James placed in their family, using the home Henry paid for as her playground. And James, how dare he? How dare he walk into that house, eat at their table, laugh with Benjamin, and then kiss his friend's mother behind his back? Henry forced himself back into the app. He needed to understand the full extent of it. He spent the next several hours reviewing all the footage from recent days. And he found more, much more. Natalie and James weren't limited to a single kiss. The cameras captured earlier meetings Henry had missed, Natalie pinning James against the kitchen wall, whispering in his ear while her hands moved over his body. In one recording, James tried to pull away, saying something that made Natalie laugh before yanking him back. There was a clear pattern: she hunted, he resisted briefly, then gave in. It was a systematic seduction, and Natalie was winning round after round. The anger Henry felt was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It wasn't explosive or immediate, it was cold, calculated, settling deep in his chest and dictating his next moves. He wouldn't confront Natalie with shouting. He wouldn't hit James, though the urge was strong. No. Henry would handle this properly, so thoroughly that there'd be no room for denial, manipulation, or escape. He made copies of all the recordings and stored them in 3 different places: a USB drive, an email account, and the cloud. That same afternoon, he consulted a divorce attorney and presented the evidence. The lawyer assured him it was more than enough for a favorable case. Then Henry planned the confrontation. It wouldn't happen right away, but soon. He needed Benjamin present. His son deserved to know, as painful as it would be. He needed to understand who his mother really was, and who his so-called best friend truly was. On Friday night, Henry told Benjamin they needed to have a serious family talk on Saturday. His son looked worried, asked if everything was okay. Henry assured him it would all become clear soon. Natalie, overhearing the mention of a family meeting, seemed only mildly curious, completely unsuspecting. After all, she'd been careful, or so she thought. On Saturday afternoon, Henry prepared everything. He connected his laptop to the living room TV. Benjamin came home around 3, returning from the library where he'd been studying. Natalie was in the kitchen making coffee. Henry asked them both to sit on the couch. His posture, the seriousness on his face, finally triggered an alarm in Natalie. She sat slowly, hands folded in her lap, eyes alert. Benjamin was confused, anxious, glancing between his father and mother, trying to make sense of what was happening. Henry took a deep breath. There was no easy way to do this. He picked up the remote and pressed play. The screen showed their own living room, filmed from above. The image had a date and timestamp in the corner, Thursday, 3 days earlier. Natalie appeared in the video, followed by James. Benjamin frowned, still not understanding. But when he saw his mother approach his friend, touch his face, and pull him into a kiss, the young man went pale. Natalie jumped up, reaching for the remote, but Henry held it firmly. She started talking fast, saying it was out of context, that Henry didn't understand, that they needed to talk in private. Henry ignored her completely and switched to the next recording. This one showed Natalie and James in the kitchen. She pressed him against the counter, his hands hesitant before settling on her waist. Benjamin suddenly stood and bolted to the bathroom. Henry heard him vomiting. Natalie was crying now, begging him to turn it off, promising to explain everything. Henry finally paused the video and looked at his wife. The woman before him seemed like a stranger. In a voice eerily calm, he asked how long this had been going on. Natalie stammered that it had only been a few weeks, that she'd been confused, going through a crisis, feeling invisible, that James gave her attention Henry no longer did. The excuses were pathetic, and Henry told her exactly that. She was 40 years old enough to know that marital boredom didn't justify seducing a young man her son's age. A young man who trusted them, who saw their home as a second family. Benjamin returned to the living room, eyes red. He looked at Natalie with a mix of disgust and heartbreak that made her recoil. He asked, voice cracking, how she could do this, how she could betray his father, betray their family, and do it with James, someone he considered a brother. Natalie tried to move toward Benjamin, but he raised his hands, telling her to stay away. He said he couldn't even look at her. Henry felt a sharp pang seeing his son like that, but he knew it was necessary. Benjamin needed to see the truth, no matter how ugly. The young man walked out, saying he was going to a friend's apartment and needed time to think. Before closing the door, he turned to Natalie and said James would never be welcome in that house again, and that he himself didn't know if he'd ever be able to forgive her. Once they were alone, Henry told Natalie he wanted a divorce. She pleaded, begged for another chance, said she'd go to therapy, do anything. Henry replied he'd already hired a lawyer and that the recordings would ensure he got the lion's share of their assets, that she'd be lucky to maintain any relationship with Benjamin after what she'd done. Natalie changed tactics then, growing angry, accusing Henry of being an absent husband, of never paying attention to her, of turning their marriage into a dull routine. Henry listened in silence, then said she could list 1,000 of his flaws, but none of them justified what she'd done. None of them justified destroying their family, humiliating her husband, and manipulating a vulnerable young man who saw her as a mother figure. The following days were a silent hell. Natalie slept in the guest room. Benjamin barely came home. Henry threw himself into the divorce proceedings with mechanical efficiency. His lawyer filed the petition, attaching the recordings as proof of infidelity. Natalie hired her own attorney, but there wasn't much they could do given the evidence. She tried negotiating an equal split of assets, but Henry wouldn't budge. He knew the footage gave him the upper hand, and he used it without mercy. As for James, Henry confronted him in person. He went to the apartment the young man shared with other students and knocked on the door. James opened it, turned white at the sight of him. Henry didn't yell or threaten. He simply said James had betrayed Benjamin's trust and disrespected their family in an unforgivable way. He added that he hoped never to see him again, and that if James had any decency at all, he'd stay away from Benjamin on his own. James broke down in tears, saying he felt awful, that Natalie had started it all, that he tried to resist but had felt confused and drawn in. Henry cut him off. He said James was 23, old enough to be responsible for his own choices. It didn't matter who started it, he'd chosen to participate. He'd chosen to betray his best friend. Before leaving, Henry handed James a USB drive with copies of the recordings and warned that if he ever tried contacting Benjamin or Natalie again, he'd send the videos to James's parents, his school, and all their mutual friends. James just nodded, speechless. The divorce took 4 months. They were months of heavy silence, Benjamin trying to process his mother's betrayal, and Henry rebuilding his life brick by brick. Natalie tried reconciling with her son several times, but Benjamin wasn't ready. The young man officially moved in with Henry as soon as the custody paperwork was finalized. Even though he was an adult, he wanted it clear that he was choosing his father. The asset division was brutal for Natalie. Henry kept the house, most of the savings, and the better car. Natalie received a small percentage and had to move into a modest apartment on the other side of town. She also lost many mutual friends, as Henry didn't hide the reason for the divorce. When people asked, he gave them the plain truth: she cheated on him with our son's best friend. James vanished completely from Benjamin's life. He transferred schools, left social media, and cut ties with mutual friends. Benjamin was devastated for weeks, feeling he'd lost not only his mother but also the friend he'd considered a brother. Henry suggested therapy, and Benjamin agreed. The sessions helped him understand he wasn't to blame, that Natalie's and James's choices were theirs alone, and that he deserved better people in his life. 9 months after the confrontation, Henry had rebuilt himself. Not fully healed, the betrayal had left scars, but functional, living, moving forward. Benjamin was doing better too, more mature, with new friends and focused on his studies. Father and son had developed an even closer bond, built on brutal honesty and unwavering support. One Sunday afternoon, while grilling in the backyard, Benjamin casually mentioned he'd seen Natalie at the mall. She was with a man he didn't recognize, someone noticeably younger than her. The young man gave a bitter laugh and said it seemed his mother hadn't learned a thing. Henry just shrugged. It wasn't his problem anymore. 2 weeks later, Henry ran into Natalie by chance in the supermarket parking lot. She was carrying grocery bags, looking tired, her hair pulled back carelessly, no makeup. When she saw him, she stopped, seeming to consider whether to say something. Henry gave a polite nod, no warmth, and kept walking toward his car. He heard her call his name, the words slipping out with a mix of hope and desperation. He paused, turned. She asked how Benjamin was. Henry said his son was doing well, focused on school, happy. Natalie asked if she could see him. Henry replied that was up to Benjamin, not him, and so far, the young man hadn't shown any interest. Natalie bit her lip, eyes welling up, and asked if Henry thought his son would ever forgive her. Henry considered the question honestly. He said he didn't know, that Benjamin was processing the betrayal in his own time, and maybe one day he'd be ready to rebuild some kind of relationship with her. But it was also possible he never would. That some things, once broken so brutally, can't be fixed. Natalie started to cry, saying she regretted it every day, that she wished she could turn back time. Henry felt a twinge, not exactly pity, but an acknowledgement of her pain. He said regret was good, but it didn't change what had happened. He wished her luck and got in his car. Driving home, Henry thought about everything he'd lost and everything he'd gained. He'd lost his marriage, the illusion of a perfect family, years of memories now stained by betrayal. But he'd gained truth. He'd gained self-awareness. He'd gained a deeper relationship with Benjamin. And he'd gained the certainty that he'd done the right thing, that he hadn't accepted being disrespected, that he hadn't let the betrayal define the rest of his life. When he got home, Benjamin was in the living room studying for an exam. The young man looked up, smiled, and asked what was for dinner. Henry said they'd make pizza, like they always did on Fridays. Benjamin nodded and went back to his books. It was a simple, ordinary scene, but Henry felt grateful for that normalcy. It had taken time, pain, and hard work to get here. But he'd made it. And that was enough. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.